Podcasting from Hartford, you're listening to the Connecticut Scoreboard Podcast.
So we've got UConn-Army up this week, an exciting game. And joining me today, we've got Mitchell Northam. He's one of the editors over at Against All Enemies, the SB Nation site. So Mitchell, thanks so much for coming on to help preview UConn-Army with me.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
So I know Army comes into this season off a 9-3 record last year. They're off to a 2-0 start this year. Take us through what expectations were for this Army team heading into this season. And then so far, have they lived up to those expectations?
Yeah, I think, the expectations kind of since Jeff Monken has sort of righted the ship. That's kind of a Navy pun. But since they've kind of righted the ship there at West Point from the previous regime, since he's been there, the expectation is, these sort of seasons, kind of 7+ wins and go into a bowl game. They've done that very often. So last year, with the pandemic and all, they kind of had to rebuild their schedule from scratch. But they were able to do that. They kind of filled it up with a couple FCS opponents. And were able to get 9 wins, and they were able to be ranked, and they went bowling, lost a close game to West Virginia. So I think the expectation was for them to be good again. I think it was unclear kind of how good, because the schedule is a little bit tougher. They do have a couple of Power 5 opponents on the schedule this year in Wisconsin and Wake Forest. But yeah, the expectation, they have some key returning guys on offense, some key returning guys on defense. So the expectation was that, they were going to be pretty solid again. And so far, they've lived up to that. I don't think a whole lot of people expected them to beat Georgia State as bad as they did in week 1. But Army wasn't even favored in that game and, blew them out by, 35 points or whatever. So, yeah, I don't think people expected them to blow Georgia State out like that. But I think they've certainly met expectations so far in winning that game, and then a close one last weekend over Western Kentucky.
I'm curious to dive into the Western Kentucky game a little bit more. As I was looking at some stats, a couple things, stuck out to me. And one, I saw Western Kentucky put up 435 passing yards against Army. Was that more so attributed to the strength at quarterback from Western Kentucky, or were they able to find some holes in that Army defense that they were able to exploit in order to really capitalize on some passing yards there?
Yeah, I think, Army got a big lead kind of early. I think they were up, 28-14 heading into the fourth quarter. So Western Kentucky kind of had a lot of ground to make up. So I think they were passing maybe more often than they would have. But certainly, they made it close there at the end. Army winning by just 3. After leading by multiple touchdowns. So definitely, I think last week was probably a little bit of a wake-up call for that defense, which is led by Nate Woody. He's in his second year as defensive coordinator there. I definitely think it was probably a little bit of a wake-up call because they really weren't tested at all by Georgia State. Army controlled that game really well. And a year ago, Army had a really solid defense. I talked about before how the schedule was a little bit softer than it usually is for Army, but, by a lot of metrics, they were first or second or top 5 in the nation. And, yards allowed, points allowed. A big part of Army's defensive success is kind of keeping their offense on the field. So the defense isn't out there all the time, and you're able to do that with the triple option when you have these long, grindy drives. Last year they led the country in, plays allowed by an opposing offense. So opposing offenses only ran 55 plays per game last year against Army. And a lot of that has to do with their offense. So it sort of goes hand in hand, their offense and defense a little bit more than maybe some other teams would because of the triple option.
And that actually was another stat that really popped out to me in looking at last week's box score there in terms of the time of possession. And Army doubled up Western Kentucky. I think it was basically 40-20 in terms of time of possession. How important is that for Army in these games if they want to really take advantage and be able to beat up on these teams?
Yeah, that's a big thing for the triple option teams. The time of possession stat, because like I said, it keeps that offense on the field. It keeps them driving, and it gives the defense a rest. So especially for the service academies where maybe on the defensive side of the ball, I mean, on both sides of the ball, really, you might not have the athletes to sort of keep up with some of these bigger teams, these more well-established football schools. If you can keep your offense on the field and just keep grinding away, and, it makes the other team's offense kind of grow a little bit anxious, and, they're not, it throws teams out of their normal kind of rhythm of the game. When I think against Georgia State, Army had the ball for over 40 minutes. So, I mean, when a service academy team or a triple option team can do that, I mean, any time really, any football team, if you control possession for more than 40 minutes, you're gonna give yourself a good chance to win. That's definitely kind of part of the recipe for success for Army, for sure.
I've got a two-part one here for you. In terms of looking at this Army team, what would you say is their biggest strength? And then on the flip side, what's the biggest weakness that if UConn's going to have a chance to be in this game, be competitive, even have a chance to win, where could they possibly exploit Army?
Yeah, I think, right now their biggest strength has really been their depth and kind of versatility at the quarterback position. They played a couple of different guys against Georgia State, and the transition was kind of seamless. And against Western Kentucky, they played Christian Anderson, who started a couple games last year and, is a good seasoned veteran, but he wasn't the starter heading into week one. But last week, he ran for, I think, 126 yards or something like that. So led the team in rushing, and then also threw, which, is kind of something that these triple option teams don't do a lot. And if they do a lot, they often don't do it efficiently. Christian Anderson last week, 5 of 6, 77 yards and a touchdown. That's, about as good as you can get sometimes out of a triple option quarterback. So I definitely think quarterback is a strength for them. In terms of a weakness, I think you might have saw it last week, against Western Kentucky. If Army's defense is on the field a lot, and if they get kind of worn down, I think their passing defense can be exposed a little bit. Sometimes those defensive backs that Army has, they've proven to be a little bit opportunistic. Every now and then they'll come up with a really big interception and they can kind of flip the game that way. But I think last week, like I said before, against Western Kentucky, they got a little bit exposed in that passing game, especially in the fourth quarter when WKU was, I think they outscored Army 21-10 in the fourth quarter. So that's certainly, a sign that maybe Army's passing defense isn't as good as it was last year, or certainly has some work to do.
In terms of UConn fans who might be tuning in to watch Army for the first time here, can you give us a couple names on both sides of the ball to look out for as, some key players there?
Yeah. On offense, I mentioned quarterback Christian Anderson. He's certainly going to be somebody who has the ball in his hands a lot. If he indeed starts again, it seems like he probably will. There's one guy, who doesn't get a ton of touches, but really makes the most of it when he does. Tyrell Robinson, he's a slot back, but they use him in the running game and in the passing game. And he's a guy who kind of has breakaway speed. He's a sophomore. This past week against Western Kentucky, he rushed 7 times for 81 yards. Wow. Against Georgia State, he had, one catch, but took it 40 yards to the house. So he's a guy who kind of, when he gets the ball in his hands, can make things happen. On the defensive side of the ball, Jabari Moore is certainly somebody who, like I talked about before, is kind of one of those opportunistic defenders. Had a couple interceptions last year, had one against Georgia State. So he's somebody who certainly, if a ball kind of gets thrown the wrong way in his area, can make some things happen. And Arik Smith is kind of one of their primary pass rushers and a guy who racks up a lot of tackles. I think against Georgia State, he might have gotten the backfield a couple of times and had a forced fumble as well. And against Western Kentucky, played pretty well too. 6 tackles, I think. So, yeah, Reek Smith and Jabari Moore are 2 guys for sure that I would keep an eye on defense.
Great. And I know this is going to be a matchup I know we're going to see a lot of in the future with both UConn and Army as independents here, and they've got some future games scheduled. You got a prediction this week for this game?
Man, I mean, I was looking at the spread earlier, and I think
Yeah.
it's up to 34 points in some circles. I'm not sure that it's going to be that big of a blowout. I mean, it might be, but I just sort of based on what we saw Army's defense do last week, where they kind of let up a little bit at the end. I'd be surprised if it was that big of a blowout. 35 points or whatever. But I do think Army will win, just based on kind of what we've seen from UConn this year. I do think that Army wins. This is probably a game that, as long as these two teams stay as independents, this will probably happen, and maybe every season, just based on how close they are to each other. I mean, it's a regional game, kind of makes sense for both sides. We might see a lot more Army UConn in the future.
And I'll get you out of here on this one. For those who might be making the trip up to West Point for the first time, or tuning in on TV, I know one of the best parts about going to one of these games at a service academy is, the ceremonies and all that's that happens around the game. Can you break down a little bit what it's like being at a game at one of these service academies?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I haven't had the chance to go to a game at West Point yet. I'm hoping to get there. But I've been to Navy, and I've been to the Army Navy game. I've been to both of those multiple times. And it's a really, if you're a college football fan in general and you've never been able to get to kind of one of these service academy schools, for a game like that, it's really cool. You got the pregame march on. For Navy, it's the midshipmen. With Army, it's the cadets. It's a really cool, just kind of, pageantry is kind of the cliche kind of term that a lot of people use, but it is really kind of a cool thing to see. I'd put it up there with any of those other kind of pre-game traditions, the Virginia Tech fans doing, the Metallica song, or Enter the Sandman, anything like that. I mean, I think it's right up there. It's a really cool atmosphere that you probably won't get anywhere else.